Hello, and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily. This is a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder, chief academic officer here at Mozilla, and I use AI as a thinking partner to prepare each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. So we've been tracing a path over the last 3 episodes. We started with research showing that passive AI use harms student engagement. We outlined what good teacher AI use actually requires. And then we looked at why those conditions are hardest for early career teachers and why that matters. And today, in the last part of our 4-part series, we're going upstream. We're asking, where do these habits form? And right now, there's a specific problem we need to talk about in teacher preparation. Everyone is learning AI at the same time. The supervisors, faculty, and cooperating teachers who are supposed to evaluate AI-assisted lesson planning don't yet have a framework for assessing it. And here's what makes it even harder, is that the thinking can become invisible. You can't easily tell if a lesson plan is a candidate's work or minimally revised AI output, even if you're paying close attention. These models are advancing fast. And roughly 80% of first-year teachers come from undergraduate education programs. So what happens in those programs right now will shape the teaching profession for the next 30 years. Now, I spent several years working in teacher preparation, both in university programs and working with schools on instructional coaching. And there's a moment I've reflected on since that time. I was working with a master teacher, one of the best in the entire network, who was piloting a middle school math technology program. The system was sophisticated. It managed the learning pathway, personalized content, tracked progress. Every student was on a device. And on paper, it looked efficient, well-designed, exactly what you might hope for if you were trying to personalize learning. But midway through the lesson, this teacher turned to me and asked me, "What am I supposed to be doing right now?" She wasn't being difficult or resistant. She was genuinely confused because the technology absorbed so much of the instructional decision-making, what to present next, how to differentiate, what feedback to give, that her role had been reduced to monitoring. What a waste of her talents. What struck me watching her was what was missing from the room. There was no moment where she had to anticipate student thinking, no moment where she had to make a judgment call, no moment where she had to own a decision because she'd thought about her specific students and made a choice based on that thinking. In that moment, that's what pedagogical thinking looks like, when a teacher can answer, why did you sequence it that way? Or what makes you choose that example? With specificity rooted in knowing who her students are. So you fast forward to now, a teacher candidate in a practicum gets an assignment to plan a lesson or a unit. They're stressed, they're juggling a lot, they use Claude or GPT. The AI generates something reasonable, learning objective sequence, formative checks. It's competent. And then a supervisor needs to evaluate it. And the challenge is, did the candidate do the thinking with AI as a thinking partner? Or is this an AI-generated lesson plan with minimal revision? You can't easily tell by looking at it. The output is too polished, and the revision work doesn't leave obvious traces. A candidate might change one example, reorder one section, rewrite the explanation, and keep the rest of the AI scaffolding. That's thoughtful pedagogy, but it looks the same as minimal revision. The thinking has become invisible, and supervisors, even good supervisors, experienced supervisors, don't yet have a way to assess it. So here's what needs to change. Stop grading the final lesson plan. Grade the decision log. I'm saying this drawing from a paper by Tina Austin called When AI Agents Can Complete the Assignment: Practical Strategies for Designing Tasks That Still Require Human Thinking. Austin argues that AI agents have a specific weakness. They can generate one polished answer, but they can't maintain a coherent decision history. They can't explain why they changed their mind. They can't connect today's choice to yesterday's constraint. And that weakness is exactly what you need as a supervisor. It's how you're going to see your student teachers thinking. So here's how it works. Require candidates to document in real time as they design the lesson 3 instructional choices they considered and why they ruled out 2 of them. What constraint from their students shaped their final choice? And what they'd change after seeing how students actually responded to the lesson they deliver. This is different from reflection. Reflection is usually written after the fact and often sounds generic. A decision log that's timestamped, specific, and tied to actual student work is going to show whether a future teacher is thinking pedagogically or just assembling a lesson. And here's why I think this matters to you as a supervisor. An AI can generate a plausible reflection. It can't reconstruct a genuine pedagogical pivot. If a candidate can answer, when you changed your instructional approach, what specifically did your students do that forced the change? With concrete evidence, that means that they thought their way through it. If the answer is vague or generic, you know the reasoning wasn't there. The goal is to make the thinking visible and traceable. The lesson plan itself tells you what the candidate produced. The decision log tells you whether they thought. One concrete question you might ask is, why did you choose that example instead of the one the AI suggested? If they can answer that with, because my students struggle with X and that example builds on what they already know, then you know that they're thinking. But if they say, it seemed better, or the AI gave me 5 options and I picked one, they're not. The practical payoff is that if a student can't articulate why they made a choice, that's exactly when you know you need to push back. That's when supervision does its job. You can ask the hard questions, force them to revise, and eventually, through that process, they're going to learn what it actually means to think through a lesson. However, if you skip that and grade the polished lesson and move on, they're going to graduate never having done the work. What's at stake here is that teacher professionalism depends on judgment. Teaching is a craft that requires knowing your students, anticipating their thinking, and making these real-time decisions. If your candidates are learning in a system where they can pass without that thinking being visible and supervised, you're in danger of not preparing professionals, but rather material administrators. And at the end of the day, this really matters to student learning. When teachers don't own their instructional choices, when they're using generic AI-generated materials without thinking deeply about how their specific students learn, we've seen from research that students feel the difference. We talked about a paper last week out of UPenn that shows that they are actually less engaged and actually learn less. And it's going to matter to teacher retention. You already know early career teachers leave at alarming rates. Part of the reason is that they never develop the competence and judgment that makes teaching sustainable. If a generation of teachers graduates from your program without having struggled through real lesson design, without having defended their thinking to a supervisor, without having learned to revise and own their own work, they're likely to burn out faster. So if you're a supervisor or teacher educator, what needs to be true? I'm going to give you 5 things that I think need to be true. First, productive struggle, which we've talked about a lot, must be protected at the core of learning to teach. We've talked about teachers as learners, and that teaching and preparing to teach is itself a learning process. Candidates need to struggle with the work of designing lessons. They need to plan something, teach it, see what actually happens, and revise based on that learning, then try again. AI can support parts of this cycle, but not the thinking parts, not the part where they have to own a choice. Second, revision and ownership have to be explicit and they have to be supervised. A candidate shouldn't hand in a lesson plan that came from an AI without you asking, why this example? Why this sequence? What were you thinking about your students when you made this change? Third, AI should remove friction that prevents thinking, but not the thinking itself. If the candidate spends 3 hours searching for examples across 15 websites, you can say, use AI to find candidates, then think about which one works for your students. That's an example of removing what you might think of as non-productive friction. But if a candidate is supposed to be thinking about scaffolding and they ask AI to design the scaffolding, that's a problem. Fourth, you should model good AI use yourself. When you're planning a unit or a supervision conversation, you might say, I used AI to generate 5 possible approaches. Here's 2 that I'm using for this class, and here's my thinking behind that. In saying that, you're teaching something different than making tools available and letting candidates figure it out on their own. And fifth, you need support too. As I mentioned at the top, we're all learning together here, and you didn't train on how to supervise AI-assisted work. Your institutions need to invest in your own professional development to do this, and you can push them on that. So if you're a faculty member supervising candidates right now, these are the questions that I think matter. Can your candidates explain why they sequenced their lesson this way, why they chose these examples, what they predict students will struggle with? Can they point to a specific student response and explain how it changed their thinking? If you're a program leader, are you being explicit about expectations for AI use in clinical placements? Do your candidates know that engaging with AI-generated materials is fine, but using them as is not? Do your cooperating teachers know what to look for? And maybe the bigger one, do you have a way to see whether candidates are thinking? Or are you grading polished products that might tell you nothing about the actual reasoning? The research we've been discussing over the last 4 episodes comes down to one principle. Productive struggle is where learning happens. This is true for students, it's true for early career teachers, and it's true for candidates learning to teach. When you design your supervision to make thinking visible, where you protect the struggle, you're not just preparing better teachers, you're building the profession. If we're not doing that, then we're starting to train material administrators. And eventually, we're going to see the field emptying out. I'd love it if you'd share what you're grappling with. This is happening right now. As I say, we're all learning together. And the decisions you're making now will shape what kind of teachers graduate. As always, thanks for listening to AI in the Classroom Daily. In tomorrow's episode, we're going to flip the script once again and speak with Jim Bentley, a California 6th grade teacher at the beginning of his 4th decade of learning how to teach. School started last week for Jim and his students. Stay tuned for a great conversation. I hope you'll join us.